Hello, my name is Ben Wilson. Today's date is March 28th, 2019, and I am interviewing Dr. Mort Rosenberg on the Ball State campus as part of the Ball State University Honors College Oral History Project. Thank you, Mort, for agreeing to participate in this effort as we celebrate the Honors College's 60th anniversary. I'd like to begin by asking you where and when you were born.
I was born literally in Brooklyn, New York on April 9th, with a birthday approaching, you see, 1930, which I later learned was the beginning of the so-called Great Depression, about which I knew nothing. I was ultimately raised and educated through master's degree in Hartford, Connecticut, because unfortunately I was told that when I was 16 months old, my parents were divorced, and I was carried to live with my grandmother and step-grandfather, where I remained pretty much until I eventually went to the University of Iowa for my doctorate. My personal memory, believe it or not, begins when I'm 3 years old and continues on as I enter public school, because I was educated in the public schools of Hartford, Connecticut, and the college I attended was also located in Hartford, and I received a master's degree from them. There are a couple of oddities in my education that even at the time I was unable to explain the reasons. In the first place, the rules of admission to public schools differed considerably. So I actually attended kindergarten at the age of 4. At the age of 5, and I do remember this, but I don't know why it occurred, and nobody has ever explained it, although I will give you my interpretation in a moment, which should provoke a smile or two. In June, I was entering the first grade. In February of that year, I was informed I'm going to enter the second grade. So I went from first to third in 1 year. Looking back upon it, I decided they thought I was brilliant or some kind of genius, and they were greatly mistaken. In any case, I almost graduated from high school at age 16. I almost graduated with a bachelor's degree from college at age 20. If you consider my birthday is in April, May, June, and there you have it. And it was an interesting experience. But I say my personal experience, I knew nothing about we were in a depression. That comes later when you start learning things in school, particularly in high school or in higher education. I'm just one of the kids. My first recollection, which may be amusing, but it wasn't amusing to me because I was severely punished, was, quote, borrowing, unquote, a tricycle and riding back and forth across a street near my home. And I lived on a busy avenue with busy off streets. I've always been a city person, by the way, and got hit by what was then called a Nabisco truck. And I was very upset because he thought he had hurt me, and all he did was hurt my feelings. I told him where I lived. he gave my folks a box of cookies. He didn't want to lose his job. Apparently, as you remember, it's the Great Depression, didn't want to lose his job. When my parents and grandparents decided that I was fine, then I got punished. I had problems of my own creation, I'm afraid, because of my parents being divorced. I happen not to be Christian, I happen to be Jewish. And in those days, Jews' parents never got divorced, and I'm getting pointed out as the strange kid at all times. And in the 5th grade, I was not paying attention. They were talking about the class play, for example, and I was looking, I remember this so clearly, looking out the window, not paying attention because I wasn't interested. And all of a sudden, the teacher, her name was Miss Brown, said, "Martin." And I said, "Yes, what?" "You had to lead in the play," because I was the only one who was not raising the hand and saying, "Ooh, ooh, pick me, pick me." Well, I kept the lead in the play for 2 weeks because a young lady in the schoolyard upset me. So I picked up a stone and threw it at her. Unhappily, my aim was pretty good. And it got her in the leg. It drew blood. Her mother hit the ceiling, as I understand it, and that took care of the lead in the play. This was in the 5th grade. In the 6th grade, I was a feisty kid and almost gave the teacher a heart attack because I got into a fist fight in the classroom. And her name was Cora L. Thorpe. Either she was slated to, or because of me, retired at the end of that school year. It is not a pleasant feeling knowing that being a divorced kid sort of set you aside at a time when there were very few divorces. Jews never got divorced, and Christians and others rarely got divorced back in the 30s, as I understand it. Now, my knowledge of statistics may or may not be flawed, but this was my understanding at the time. So I had a chip on my shoulder, and that chip remained on my shoulder until high school, when apparently I was bright enough. I just didn't do what I was expected to do. I remember in the 4th grade, the teacher threatened. We had a major workbook in arithmetic to fill out. I just never got around to. She finally said, "If you ever wanted to be promoted, you better have that done." So apparently I did it under protest, that sort of thing. And now by this time I had learned that there was a depression because I was so young in all of these various grades. I went to junior high school at a very young age as well. And the interesting thing is that my favorite subject was always history. And I always wanted to teach, although I could not explain why this occurred to me, but I always wanted to teach. And I ended up in higher education largely because when I did my student teaching, I discovered that you needed to be more of a policeman than a teacher. And consequently, I also learned that things are not necessarily fair in this life. I remember missing the honor roll in high school because in the homeroom, I was sitting next to where students, myself included, kept their books. And overnight for those not needed to go home for homework or what have you. And some kid said something to me, and I promptly got what in those days they called demerits. And if you had 4 demerits, you could not be on the honor roll. And needless to say, I had 4 demerits for some other infraction. And I said, I didn't say a word. He said, the teacher said, her name was Miss Reagan. You see what sticks in one's mind. And she said, it takes 2 for a conversation. I said, I can't help it if I'm sitting here and he makes a comment. And she said, nevertheless, it takes 2. So I promptly got up to leave the room, and she said, where are you going? I said, I'm going to leave the room for just a bit, otherwise you'll have grounds to have me expelled from school. Because I was that livid with rage. And my mother was so astounded when I actually made the honor roll eventually, very quickly, that she actually bought me what was then a war bond, because the World War II was on. That is what ended the Depression, by the way, of course. And I finally woke up to eliminate the chip, but the size of a tree trunk on my shoulders. And suddenly my grades, I'll give you one example, 9th grade. In those days, you had junior high school, 7, 8, and 9. 9 was considered the first year of high school, but you then went to senior high school, 10, 11, and 12. My grades in June of my 9th grade were C, 2 Ds, and an F. When I got out of high school, by contrast, 3 years later, I was in the top 5% of my class. Hence, was able to get admitted to a fine college. You've heard of the Ivy League. This is sort of a junior Ivy League. There were smaller schools, and admissions were highly selective, et cetera, et cetera. I later learned that the orientation they give you sometimes is not entirely accurate. That when they say, look to the left of you, look to the right of you, the person was not going to be here at the end of the year. The truth is that never occurred, because once you were in, after being carefully selected anyway, the chances are it was only up to the individual if he or she, in those days it was only a he. My college became co-ed in 1970 or 71, and I had graduated in 51. You know, so you see the difference. But in any case, I finally lived up to what they saw back in grades 1, 2, and 3. It took a while.
And what year did you graduate from high school? And what was the name of the high school as well?
Weaver High School. And I graduated in 1947. And in those days, you had to commute if you accepted. The name of the college is Trinity College. And you had to commute if you lived within a 25-mile radius, because if all of these schools want to be national and international in their attraction, and they cannot, because the war had recently ended, they had no way to have done enough building for residence halls. And so all of us, regardless of education, whether you went to a private school at one time, I went to a public school, obviously, you had to commute. And We all did. And so I lived at home, obviously, until I went off to the University of Iowa. At the same time, I also worked. I worked at a local hospital, and I worked up from being a mail delivery boy to an admissions clerk by the time I was in my upper years of my undergraduate program. And that job was waiting for me every time I came back from Iowa, as I did the vacation relief. The second example I experienced that life cannot be fair was when I was a freshman at college. This would be in the year 1947, 48. and I had an excellent grade going in one particular class. And the professor died. And his replacement told us that everything we did beforehand was out the window. And so if an A went out the window and became a B, is how he judged me. So we used to tell our children when they would complain, that's not fair. And I would say, life's not fair. Get used to it. That's the way it is, reality. But somehow I managed to get this far.
One of the things you've mentioned multiple times so far through the interview is World War II, which went on from 1941 to 1945. Could you describe maybe some of your experiences in America during the time?
Well, being too young to serve, I'm afraid I was a nut in this respect that I wanted the war to last long enough so I can get in and kill Germans. I was not interested at the time in killing Japanese, but I had good reason for wanting to kill Germans. So I developed a reputation for being both anti-Japanese and anti-German. And it was largely accurate, but partially inaccurate, because from time to time I discovered later on that there would be a Japanese student in my class, or there would be a German student in my class, and they were not treated any differently, because the thing that I cherished most was a reputation for fairness. I was known as a very hard SOB, but I tell you, he's fair. And that was the student line on me. Whatever, he will be fair. Now, they've done, for a reason I never quite understood, other than the fact that I was having personal problems with my soon-to-be ex-wife, not my current wife, of 46 years, I might add, who entered Ball State the same year I did, in 1961, by the way. There was some nonsense that I was anti-woman, that any woman in my class can forget about getting an A. So I learned later that the social studies chairman, remember there was no history department, social studies chairman checked out all the grades and saw all kinds of women had gotten A's. So what is this nonsense that he's going to penalize women? Back to my reputation, fairness. A hard SOB, but fair. And I cherish that reputation, always.
And also throughout the interview so far, you've mentioned that you went to the University of Iowa for your PhD program.
Yes.
And you actually ended up graduating in 1957, correct?
Correct.
What was your area of interest in what you wrote your dissertation on while you were there?
I happen to be a political historian. The common belief is you stay away from religion and politics insofar as you can, you know, that sort of thing. And that's my cup of tea, religion and politics. I'll come back to religion in a moment, because there is one thing that I need to point out that went on and I had nothing to do with it one way or the other. And at any rate, I had the task, even when we ended up teaching in the honors program, of convincing the students that they could disagree with everything and anything I offer as an opinion, and it will not affect their ultimate grades. And that was not an easy thing to do. I happen to be a lifelong Democrat. Probably as an erroneous beginning when my family blamed Herbert Hoover for the Depression. So, and he is a Republican. Later on, my education, in my opinion, solidified my anti-Republican stance, but that was neither here nor there. Getting back to this, the one group of students who came to Ball State who avoided my class like the plague, and that was not because of me personally, but because of my religion. They were Arabs, they were Muslims, and they were told to religiously avoid taking any class from any Jewish professor because they're automatically anti-Muslim, which is not true, because I have had occasion to teach overseas with Ball State University's overseas program on several occasions. And one of the students in that class was a Muslim woman who did not wear a headscarf, by the way. Nevertheless, she was a Muslim. And her comment was, for a non-Muslim, you did pretty well. The other group of religious students that one runs into from time to time are the Mormons. And for the Mormons, I was told by one of my students who turned out to be a Mormon, I don't know students' religion, there was no card to fill out when you register for a class. You got it all wrong, Gentile. Now that was interesting because Jews call non-Jews Gentiles. And they said, but not bad for a Gentile, nevertheless. And nobody ever went away upset or uptight or went over my head to this or that chairman, etc. Because again, fair play was more important than anything in that particular regard. Well, I eventually then ended up with a job in Connecticut. Now you see, I had done what a Northeasterner rarely ever does. A Northeasterner, New Englander if you will, does not leave the Northeast. And I wanted to leave the Northeast. And that was totally unheard of by my friends, relatives, family. I remember being at Ball State for 15 years and visited my mother, who still lived in Hartford. And she asked, when you're coming back to settle down? I tried to stay in Iowa because I fell in love with Iowa. Now, the fact that Iowa was politically conservative made no difference to me. The fact that Indiana is politically conservative made no difference to me. I start out the classes, and I might say I used to have sleepless nights before every new term began. Students worry about first day of class with a teacher that they might know of, or there's a scuttlebutt on. They have nothing on me because I had sleepless nights. So anyway, I'd come out in front and tell them that who I am, what my background is, and then do my darndest, and largely, if not 100%, but largely successful in convincing them that they can disagree with me and still get a fair shake. And I think that I succeeded.
And could you describe, you mentioned a little bit about this, your time at Danbury State College in Danbury, Connecticut from 1958 to 1961?
That's where I ended up having to leave because I was always interested in research and publication. This is what you do when you have a doctorate. It is not just merely the key to higher education teaching, but it is also to be expected of a person with a PhD to lend his expertise in print to those who might be interested in learning more about a given political field, which of course would be political history. And when I learned that the chairman of the then social studies department there, notice the idea of a history department even there was not like Ball State initially, social studies, said to me, I hope you're not taking time out from your classroom preparations. I knew immediately it's time to look around for a job. And Iowa was out. There was this, well, I had a classmate who was one step ahead of me and got his degree ahead of me, and he got an opening that he stayed with it at one of the Iowa colleges that I was after till he retired. And he was always my rival in all classes and seminars at the university. It was an interesting 5 years there. I could have done it in less, but I was so young it just didn't make sense. I think that's when I started growing a mustache and a goatee just to look older. But at any rate, there was a chance to go out to California, San Diego, 3,000 miles away from my home base, which would be my parents who were still with us at the time. And consequently, I learned that some place called Ball State might be interested. So I submitted my name. They must have liked what they saw. Some fellow by the name of John R. Emmons was the president, and everything he promised was delivered. He said, if you sign up with Ball State, you will grow with the institution. If we offer you the job, will you take it? He was as careful as, and I said, if I'm offered a job, I shall certainly guarantee to take it. I thought it would last 3 to 5 years. It lasted 34 years, plus another 11 years with the overseas program and so forth. Now at that time, remember, in 1961, when my wife, Linda, came, and she eventually married a name that is familiar around campus. She married the twin brother of a fellow named Rent, Al Rent. And Al Rent was made, I don't know, some kind of citizen of the year of Muncie, for example. And he was well known around campus. Well, his twin brother is Andy, or those are their middle names. That's how they went by. And at any rate, I had, I think, a pretty darn successful career here at Ball State, including getting involved in the honors program.
And when you first started at Ball State, were you teaching any honors program courses that you can recall?
Not the first year, I don't think. I'm trying to think. At the time, Ball State had what it called what we called, we being the faculty, the warm body policy. If you can teach anything. So if you're in social studies, that means you can teach economics, or you can teach political science, or history, or sociology. And seems to me I taught something in political science, but that is a vague memory. Somewhere along the line, while it was a teacher's college, the teacher's college dean had the ear of the president, and he thought that having an honors program, forget about an honors college, but having an honors program was elitist. And we, who disagreed with that thinking, thought that he was certainly going for the lowest common denominator. You weren't giving a person who happens to have more ability, academic ability, not necessarily more brain capacity, or maybe brain capacity. I'm not sure what the measurements are. I've always billed myself as a near genius because I was invited to take a test for Mensa. You've heard of Mensa? It is the elite organization for people with superb IQs. I missed by 2 points. I think I got 145 and you needed 147. I don't know where I went wrong, but so I billed myself as a near genius, let it go at that, with a smile and tongue in cheek, etc. But somewhere around the second year, perhaps, the history department, the social studies department / history, and the English department were principal supporters initially, as I understand it, of the honors program. And I ended up teaching a program that did not have a central theme as I had developed ultimately when I ended up teaching in the Honors College, a seminar, but was largely, I call it topics of interest, and let it go at that. I don't remember, honestly, how many students were in there. I remember 3 students, 2 women and 1 white male, and one of the women was white. And she was ultimately married, I might add, to one of the newspaper editors of Muncie papers. And the other one was an African-American student. We didn't use that expression then. The expression we used then was acceptable, namely Negro. Right? And we had a very open and free discussion about all kinds of things. I once looked at this Negro student and came right out with it and asked her, "So what's wrong with being called a nigger?" And she said, "Nothing, kike." The term kike is a derogatory term aimed at Jews. And I said, "Point brilliantly taken." Now, since that time, things have altered in reference to students of color. I remember in high school, for example, I once called a student, "You black somebody or other," and she said, "Who are you calling black?" They resented that. Finally, we can say African American and get on to things.
And I believe one of the courses you were talking about was an honors colloquium course, which was labeled, at least under 1963, as SS 399. Do you remember any of that? You just described them as topics of interest. What were some of the topics of interest that you discussed in the class?
I regret to say I have no recollection of the honors colloquium, as you call it. I know of teaching a class in the honors college, but I have no recollection of the colloquium, and I don't know why I have no recollection of it.
And kind of along the same lines, and if you don't remember, it's fine, is another class I found that you taught also in the 1963 to 1964 class was SS 115, which was titled The World in the 20th Century, which was an honors course. Do you by chance recall anything about that course?
No.
Okay. And some of the people that were in the honors program at the early years, the head of the honors program was Jerome Fallon at the time. Do you by chance have any memories or discussions you had with him while you were at Ball State?
No.
And then, so would you say at this time with the honors program in the early and just through the 1960s, the honors program, it was a set of courses, but people weren't really invested in the program itself, or like not as it would be later on when it became the honors college?
Well, so long as so long as the Teachers College controlled the situation, you would not be able to get much in the way of student participation in the honors program. I'm not sure how I ended up teaching the particular course or seminar or whatever you want to call it. I did at the time, maybe in spite of, not because of, because Teachers College was totally uncooperative. Once it was decided to become a university, then Teachers College lost its influence, lost its control, because then the the ball was on a different court, and as a result, they would previously would veto anything called a honors college, so long as they were in control. The honors program existed despite of them, not because of them. And I remember being at some meeting might have been University, I don't know if you call it the University Senate then, or whether it had a different name. Eventually it became University Senate. And I served, I think I had mentioned in my biographical sketch, I served for 2 years as chair, and got into all kinds of conference differences with the administration. It used to be the administration controlled everything from top down and controlled the appointments of chairs and so forth. And I remember rising in this then University Senate and asking whether or not the dean of the College of Arts, not Fine Arts, but the College of Science and Arts, I think it was called. I can't remember the exact title. And Burkhardt himself, why they were afraid of democratic procedure. I mean, do we not live in a democracy? You know, blah, blah, United States. And so happened I was up for promotion that year. And one of my colleagues at the end of the session came up to me and said, well, kiss your promotion goodbye. Burkhardt was not that person, that kind of person.
And by Burkhardt, you mean Richard Burkhardt?
Yeah,
correct?
of course.
Okay.
He did not punish you because you disagreed with him. If there was a reason for being promoted based on solid evidence, then you're going to get promoted. Although the faculty handbook of the old Teachers College tradition had something which may amuse you. It told you that when you entered the position, you can expect, I'm not giving you verbatim, this is a general gist, you can expect to be promoted in 4 or 5 years to associate professor. And if you're not promoted in 4 or 5 years, you might want to reevaluate your position at Ball State. And then it went on. You know, once you're an associate professor, you can expect to be promoted in 4 or 5 years and granted tenure. And if you're not promoted in 4 or 5 years and granted tenure, then you might want to reevaluate your position at Ball State. There was nothing in it about any publication or anything of that nature. And I once asked a colleague about that. I said, what does that mean in actual practice? And he said to me, basically it means you can do anything you want, and if you do it to a student and the student doesn't complain, you're home free. I said, that is a wide latitude. He said, tenure was virtually automatic in those days. Well, it's changed considerably, as it should have been. As many as 70 to 80 people got promoted annually, whether they deserved it or not, because they would always be recommended by their departments. It goes without saying. With the advent of a fellow named Cook as provost, changes were made. So now you had to have a vita that had detailed information about your accomplishments. You had to have decent, not superb, but decent student evaluations. You had to have publications either in progress or accepted in refereed journals, and presumably you know what I mean by refereed. And then on those merits, 10 or 12 people across campus may or may not be promoted. Has to do with availability of funds from the state legislature. And then a new element was introduced that got everybody's hackles up, and that had to do with I don't know what term to use, whether you call it a special bonus or some sort of extra dollars going to the person who achieved a wee bit more than the person who was also promoted that year but didn't achieve as much. And eventually endowed chairs began showing up. Then we really became a university in reality, not just in name.
And in 1965, as you were just mentioning, Ball State went from Ball State Teachers College to Ball State University. What was your reaction to the name change and the changes that came from going from a teachers college to a university?
I'll give you my answer in just a moment, but first let me say the common feeling, which may have been a myth or may have been apocryphal, was that between the time he left his office, President Emmons made a decision. Between the time he left his office and got to a meeting at Teachers College, he decided we need to be a university. My reaction was favorable. I was very happy with that reaction. I was also happy, believe it or not, with the change that was eventually introduced by Provost Cook, because I always thought, as did several of my colleagues at the time, that we're lumped in with the common denominator, and we know we deserve promotion or consideration more than certain other people. But when you have virtually automatic promotions and virtually automatic tenure, there's going to be a certain sameness and certain unfairness going to be involved, and you learn to live with it, so to speak. I remember, again, this may be anecdotal, but it's the truth. I'd been promoted to full professor, and I took a manuscript for a book to mail it to the post office. It was in the student center at the time, the old student center.
And where was the old student center? Is it the same? The L.A. Pittenger Student Center?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Well, there was a new building that was used or something. But anyway, colleague happened. What are you doing, Rosenberg? I'm sending a manuscript for publication. And he said, you have to do that. You're already a full professor. I mean, how do you explain that? So anyway, that's the way it went in that respect. But I was always in favor of the honors program. If you say I taught a couple of colloquium, I am not certain anymore what they might have been and what the topics might have been. If it was current events, for example, whatever was the current events or the general topics of the day, we participated. And getting the students to open up was always the trick.
And what were some of the things you did in classes to try to get students to open up and have more of a conversation in your classes?
to being outlandish, to being the devil's advocate, to making statements that just bounced off the wall, that no intelligence, semi-intelligent student could just let rest. For example, I'd announce right off the bat my politics, and said anyone who's not a Democrat is not very intelligent. Intelligent people are Democrats. That got a reaction. I didn't get reported or anything, but that got a reaction. Hands went flying up. And we can then end up with a discussion of whether or not what I said had any, which it did not, of course, validity. We live in and I've said this in class too, we live in a society where students come from some towns. This was before there were whole bunches of illegal Hispanics, believe me. But there were no blacks in the town, no Jews in the town. There may or may not have been Mormons. There was a kind of a standoff between devout Christians, whoever that means, and Mormons, for example. When Romney was running for president, I remember seeing that some groups, I think it was in Maryland, it may not have been, may have been elsewhere, one of the states, saying he's not a really Christian. You know, Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, okay, that sort of thing. And you'd find that I said to the class, how many of you have ever seen a Jewish person? And virtually no hands went up. None. I said, are you aware that you are looking at one now? And very, very few students were aware of it because they had no basis for identifying the name Rosenberg as being a Jewish name, which it normally, but not 100%, is. The name comes, means a hill of roses. Napoleon insisted that everybody have names. Otherwise, the Jewish person was known as Isaac, the son of Jacob, the son of Israel. And he had to have second names, so they sometimes happened to be a blacksmith. So you had, I thought that Sam Smith was a Jewish name. I thought Smith was a Jewish name. Sometimes you got a name given to you at Ellis Island, which is the island through which all immigrants at one time went through. And they didn't understand what you were saying, so they gave you the name. And I remember brothers, one name was named Smith, and the other brother got the name Green. I have no idea what his name might have been, but in his pronunciation, remember they spoke no English. Well, my grandmother, for example, was the immigrant in our family. She spoke no English. She thought she was speaking English after I showed up. She came in 1900. I showed up 30 years later. By that time, she had learned English, but really her English was more Yiddish than English. And Yiddish is a form of Low German, Süddeutsch. You know.
And I'm going to switch a little bit to a different. Did you have anything else to continue on that?
Not off the, I can think about it.
Okay.
Although I did tell the class, I said, the reason you can't see my horns is because I have them sawed off to scalp level. You know, that produced a bunch of snickers, and we got along fine. We got along fine.
And one of the other things that I'm curious about, if you have any recollection of, was in 1968, there is a house, it was at 203 North College Avenue, that became the designated house for the honors program. And also John Emmons used it as well after he served his term as president of Ball State. Do you by chance recall anything about the house or any experiences you might have had in the house?
I don't recall having much way of doing with it one way or the other, no.
And
sorry.
No, you're fine. And then additionally with that, the person who came after Jerome Fallon, who was the head of the honors program at the time, was Victor Lawhead. Do you by chance have any
Yes.
connections or memories of him with the honors program by chance?
Not necessarily with the honors program. Although I, along with others, were convinced that his job was to sabotage the program, being from Teachers College.
Do you have any other experiences with Dr. Lawhead in general that you can recall?
No, he was a likable person, a very likable person, and we get along as colleagues fine in that particular regard. He introduced a concept which provoked all kinds of critical response, something called self-actualization. Students must achieve some kind of self-actualization. And none of us have quite understood exactly what he meant. And his explanation, which I don't fully recall, didn't do much to enlighten us what he meant by self-actualization. Unless you were to me, I'm again speculating, that education is what an individual student makes of it. You can be a good student, or you can be what used to be called as the Honorable C student. It's all entirely what you want to make of it. If you know you're going to go into dad's business regardless, but you wanted to be educated, but you didn't want to put in too much time, then you got what was called a gentlemanly C. If you knew you had to do on your own, and you needed to go to grad school, or at least some post-secondary higher education, even if it was, even if it was a teacher in junior high or high school, most places demanded continually course study standards, maybe even a master's, but not necessarily, but taking a minimum of at least one class a year to keep up with developments in whatever your field was allegedly supposed to be. And again, it's up to the student what he, she wanted to make of it. I happen to know, for example, of a Ball State graduate who was a top-notch student and is now a top-notch executive making 6 figures because he took advantage of his education. He didn't go to so-called Ivy League or the so-called preferred, whatever that means, schools. And he did done exceedingly well. And I think any student would have to agree. If by self-actualization is taking advantage of the opportunity as a student to get as most out of it as you can, male or female, well, for heaven's sakes, then fine. We all agree with self-actualization.
Do you believe many of the honors students you had in your honors courses and maybe other history courses were those students who were wanting to pursue and achieve a lot more and wanted to get good grades in college?
Oh, no question about it. I had an interesting self-imposed task. When I came to Ball State, the student who happened to be a woman typically can go into secretarial work, or in those days become a telephone operator, or become a teacher, or become a nurse. And I kept saying, no, 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 no. You could do whatever you want beyond those 4. Just take the right classes. Well, as it turned out, I was right. But not until Ball State entered university level. I have 3 daughters and 2 sons. And some of them were really stepchildren, but nevertheless, we call them our daughters. So it was my second marriage to my wife and her second marriage, 46 years. And I remember telling them, if anyone gives you, my biological kids went to IU. There was a problem with getting into the nursing program here. It was a political problem. The head of the nursing tried to use students to hold up the administration for money and so forth, and you can't blackmail the administration, and so the students are in the middle. So I said, I'm sorry, Robin, you're going to have to go to IU, because you can then get into clinical without waiting for the politics to end. And the 3 who went to Ball State, well, their mother, my wife is a Ball State grad. There are twin aunt and uncle, cousins, name them, Ball State grad. I think they had a grandparent. That's me. Ball State grad, and so forth. And consequently, I said to the 2 girls who attended Ball State, if anyone gives you a hard time about what you want to do, don't let them push you into this or that. You let me know. And we must have done a good job at home, because at home they stood up to me too. And so they did what they wanted to do. And only one went into teaching, and one, we're talking the Ball State ones now, and one went into something to do with the law, but then did an about-face entirely. So she then ended up life as she is now, a real estate appraiser. And the son, stepson, my wife's son, follow his footsteps into television initially, but now he's an employee. He then became an employee of the state of Mississippi, and he then, his current job is with some, I'm not sure what kind of corporation it is, but his job is to attract companies to take advantage of the talents available in Mississippi in computer-trained personnel, etc., etc. They did not follow the old tradition in that respect. Nor did we insist that they do what Mom and Dad did. Mom and Dad were teachers. As a matter of fact, that I always billed myself as just a teacher. The fact that I may have published or ended up as a full prof and so forth and so on, I was still a teacher.
And within the first decade you were here at Ball State, there were many things going on in the world. You had the Vietnam War going on, and then also at the start of the 1970s as well. I found one thing in the Orient, the Ball State yearbook, you had an interview about the women's liberation movement. Could you describe the political activity or lack of activity on Ball State's campus during this time?
There were all kinds of activity. I always took the tongue-in-cheek view, and I can't remember. I debated a pro-women's lib person, and had what I called the little old ladies in sneakers sitting in the front row. This was in the Teachers College building, one of the classrooms that, I don't know, holds 130 or 120 people, was jammed. And afraid I made an enemy of, at least temporarily, if not permanently, one of my colleagues. I took the view that the Bible said that God was created women as helpmeets, not as competitors, and they needed to stay in their places. And all this was tongue-in-cheek, and boy, the reaction was unbelievable, negative, to say the least. But the problem was that there were too many conservatives. This is about the time the Equal Rights Amendment was making its rounds, and state after state after state began ratifying till they ran into Utah with the Mormons, and then they ran into Indiana with a very conservative, the male is dominant kind of situation, and ultimately it failed to get the amount of state votes it needed because of that, as the implications of women's lib meant. That also included, although it didn't take any amendments in it, it took some laws, Title IX, for women's sports activities. The men's sports saw it as taking money away from their programs, which it might well, I mean, you got to share. And there was virtually no, I mean, Ball State had a good women's field hockey team. Well, what happens if you wanted to play basketball, not field hockey? So that took a while to get started. I happened to be chairman at one time of the athletics committee. And to show my impartiality, I attended a women's basketball game or two and a women's softball game or two, and discovered I really loved women's basketball. Why? Because the women, no matter how tall they are, do not dunk during a game. They can, but they do not. And I don't like the slam dunks. I just hate it. Because that is not what Walter Naismith had in mind when he invented basketball as a winter sport while he was, a phys ed teacher or something in Massachusetts. I think that was a state. I'm not 100% sure. And I knew about slow pitch softball, but fast pitch, like, whoa, that required a talent and ability beyond anything I could think of. And eventually there was a pro women's fast pitch baseball league, et cetera, et cetera. So the improvements on behalf of the other gender, if you will, I'm not going to get involved in, because it never came up about sex changes and gay persons and so forth and so forth and so forth. That was not apparently at that time a big issue. But I favored, and I think any fair-minded person would favor it. I'm trying to think if in high school, my youngest daughter served as a manager, naturally, of the male track team in her senior year in high school. But she didn't continue to do that. She just concentrated on education and sorority. She got into a sorority without my help, because I was prepared to make a few phone calls to some Ball State grads who knew about our daughter, well, knew the family. And if that would be this, Daddy, keep out of it. I'll do it my way. And that, by the way, is still her motto. To this day, we might make a suggestion, and she'll politely listen, and we know darn well she'll always do it her way, which is what you do. You raise your own children, and I carry this to the students. I want you to be able to stand on your own 2 feet and think for yourself. And if your thinking is something I happen to disagree with, that's not my problem, nor is it your problem. But that's what you got to do with your education, is to stand on your own 2 feet, not depend upon your parents for support any longer. And someday you're going to succeed your parents. You'll be the older generation as your parents pass on, etc. And you got to do the same with your children. And I think I've been successful in that respect.
So going back to the honors program, in 1970, Dr. Warren Vanderhill took over as the honors program director. Do you remember, have any experiences or memories about his time in the honors program, which would later actually become the Honors College in 1979?
Not really, no.
Were you teaching any courses in the honors program at that time that you can recall?
The only course I remember was the one I told you about.
Okay.
See, Dr. Vanderhill had come to Ball State, and then left Ball State for 2 years. And he learned what we all learn. He went back to his alma mater, which was in Michigan. And he learned you can't go home again. So then he came back to Ball State and asked for a promotion, which he would have received had he stayed. And I went to bat for him in the department because there was opposition. And since that time, when he became provost, forget about the Honors College dean, he became provost, and the president was a fellow named Worth, or the Worthing.
Worthen? John Worthen?
Worthen. I'd call him Dutchman, and he'd call me Uncle Morty. And the president would look and said, "My God, how do you refer to each other that way?" And we had to explain to him our past relationship, which was always good, because I recognized, in my opinion, for what it was worth, how talented the provost was. And he certainly was. And he shouldn't have to pay a penalty because he had done what so many people do and discover you can't relive your young days again.
Do you, during the time of Dr. Vanderhill, remember any of the growth maybe in the honors program that you might have seen even though you weren't teaching in the honors program at the time that you can recall?
Not specifically. I did know that not only under Vanderhill, but under his successors in the Honors College, they worked heaven and earth to persuade the qualified students to enter the program. They made it a challenging program, which I suspect you are totally familiar with. And fortunately, many students, to this day, no doubt, who could have benefited, take what I refer to as the easy way out and not take the challenges that are required. But for those who want to enter programs requiring, well, even medical and dental and whatnot, having top grades in the honors program is the key to their admission, as the various highly selected schools down the road a bit need to be able to differentiate between applicants. And the honors program is certainly a superb way to differentiate between applicants.
As I mentioned earlier, the honors program became the Honors College in 1980. Do you by chance recall any struggles there may have been between the title from honors program going to honors college amongst faculty?
Well, the Teachers College people still opposed it, but by that time it was too late because the other people in the other various colleges favored it, and so it went through successfully. Whether or not it required Senate approval, I suspect if it did, again, it got the votes it needed, simple majority, I would think. I'm not sure.
Yes, it did receive, I believe it was approved by the Senate. Yes.
You know, there was a time, by the way, this is sort of an aside, I was so outlandish in my views about everything that I couldn't even get a successful adjournment vote. And one of my colleagues would, when he wanted to get something enacted, would come to me beforehand and said, "Look, you got to do me a favor, and you got to oppose me." I said, "But I don't." He said, "No, you got to. It won't float unless you oppose me, because if you oppose me with your standing in the Senate, it'll go through." Well, later on, my standing changed completely. I'm not sure how. Maybe they discovered it was tongue-in-cheek at all times, and that the real me was not the projected me who might make an outlandish statement to try to get a reaction from the Senate. I remember a discussion over a word that might amuse you. Keep using the word visitation. You know, the provost at the time reserved the right to have a classroom visitation. So one of my colleagues in the history department got up and said, "Why do you keep using an incorrect term? A visitation is like an aura or a body from on high. You're just talking about a classroom visit, aren't you?" So we got a discussion over the terminology, visitation. And when somebody dies, they still use the term visitation hours are. What they really mean is visit hours are, or visiting hours are, etc. You know, pay your respects, etc. But anything and everything in those days were discussed in the Senate. And they even, in those days, women's dormitory had hours. The women had to be in by a certain time. And there was a move to ban, you know, come on, we're a university. Women are adults. Abolish the hours. One of the associate deans of something or other got up and opposed it, the change. And another colleague shouted out in the midst of the Senate, "Don't you trust your daughter?" But later on, the Senate was reformed and revised so that everything under the sun need not be discussed in the Senate. Although it was fun to have it the old way, as you can well imagine.
One of the things we found as we were reading through Dr. Bruce Galehood and Dr. Tony Edmonds' book, the History of Ball, which is the Ball State history, was the struggle maybe between the administration or the board of trustees and the university and the faculty members between trying to get things accomplished that maybe the faculty wanted to see more of. Do you by chance recall any situations like this?
It occurred to me before I responded, I didn't answer your question about Vietnam.
Oh.
There was a big rally on campus. Big rally on campus. And what the students didn't know was that the campus police were in plain clothes, walking around to zero in on any troublemakers, whatever that's supposed to mean. You may recall that on May 4th, was it 1970? But certainly May 4th, in Kent, Ohio, some students were shot. And I remember taking a it was not tongue-in-cheek, it was a mistake on my part. And I knew it was a mistake as soon as the students got shot. And that is, I favored the Vietnamese War. But when students get killed for their views, then I know that I'm wrong. Tony Edmonds was accurate in his views, because he was the one who early opposed it. And I used to needle Tony by saying, Ho Chi Minh would no doubt grant you his highest civilian award for favoring his position, wouldn't he, Tony? And he just laughed it off and let it go at that. The problem was that they were talking, getting back to your more recent question, they were talking about having a American Federation of Teachers union and threatening strike action, and I was in favor of a union. We agreed that if any of the local unions ever went on strike, we would not cross the picket lines. Or if we did have to teach a class, we would not do their work for them. So if the custodians went on strike for whatever reasons, we just let the trash pile up. We would not empty the waste baskets that they would normally have done, that sort of thing. And then when one of the persons who succeeded to become president of the American Federation of Teachers spoke to the Board of Trustees. The president is, of course, always present at the Board of Trustees meetings, and accused them of all kinds of, took a very radical position that those of us who were there cringed, and we knew that the game was lost in that regard. So I think that was one of the problems between the administration and the faculty. There was somebody in the English department whose name escapes me, who was to the left, if it's possible to be more leftist than the Russian communist, and he was a thorn in the side of the administration constantly, and that created ill feelings as well. What most of us simply wanted was to be given was to have the university administration create the atmosphere where we can do our jobs in the classroom. Visits or visitation or none, you know. I had nothing to fear from somebody showing up and sitting in on it, because if anyone has something to fear, then there's something wrong. I mean, what's wrong with a visitor or a guest dropping? So long as they don't disrupt things. Students may disrupt and visitors may not. So I think that was a factor involved in the antagonism that seemed to exist between some members of the faculty and the administration. Then when merit pay came in, that's the word I was searching for earlier, the extra dollars. Merit pay came in, oh God.
Could you elaborate a little bit more on that?
Teachers College and our college, Science and Humanities, finally got the name right, were always opposed to merit pay on the grounds that we didn't think anyone was more meritorious than the next guy. But apparently the administration and former provost Cook and others disagreed. And so one particular department set up a merit pay scheme that only 3 people in the whole damn department would benefit. Whereas the history department, by contrast, set up a scheme where everybody and their second cousin could benefit somehow. You know, somewhere there would have to be a happy medium. I think that battle is no longer being fought, I would think. I don't know, because I have not followed what has happened since. But I think that was a factor in the antagonisms that you mentioned previously. And I couldn't think of the term merit pay until just now.
As we move a little bit farther forward in your time here at Ball State, with the, as I mentioned, in 1979 it became the Honors College from the Honors Program. In the 1980s, did you have any experiences or classes you taught with the now Honors College?
Well, I don't remember what year it was that I taught a seminar on the Constitution. That's an experience I had.
Could you discuss maybe what you talked a little bit more about, in depth about in the class about the Constitution?
Well, I forget the dean's last name. His first name was Arno.
Wittig?
Wittig, that's it. He was the dean at the time. And the first day we met, and I can't recall whether or not it was I think it was a 2-hour seminar. Was it on Tuesday and Thursday? I don't recall. I think it might have been. And the first day of the seminar, I told them that we were going to examine the Constitutional Convention of the United States, and that everyone in there would take a figure from the Constitution. And I would be the president, George Washington, and that you people need to know the following, and I gave a list of the members of the Constitutional Convention. Not all the members, the ones who did the most participating, based largely, if not exclusively, but largely on James Madison's notes on the Constitutional Convention. And he said, I want you to come to class with 3 names so that we can get you to be these people. One of you will be James Madison, one of you will be James Wilson, one of you will be John Adams, one of you will be Benjamin Franklin, and so forth. And then I said, that was the following week. And then I discussed further, and I said, and I'm going to dismiss you now for 2 weeks, because I want you to immerse yourself with what your character stated during the convention. And somewhere along the line, I told you this personally in our telephone conversation, somewhere along the line, I said something that alienated 2 of the women students. And didn't alienate anybody else, because when Wittig read the evaluations, he said to me, you got a couple of negatives here, haven't you? And I said, I honestly don't know what it was I said directly or offhand or whatever to do this, other than the fact that these 2 students were bosom buddies, apparently going back to high school. And whatever one person said, the other would swear to, and vice versa. Whereas the rest of the class thought everything was fine. And their evaluations of me were quite good, and my evaluations of them were also quite good, except I did again, I'm recalling, I'm pretty sure, that at least 2 or 3 students did not get A's, and guess who didn't? Were among them, because they were so resentful. They didn't want to do what was required, because a great deal of study and preparation was needed, and it got off pretty well, so far as I can remember. It worked the way I had hoped it would work. And so the only thing is, use your own modern terminology. Do not use the language that might have been in use in those days. And this is fully understandable. Matter of fact, even the spellings were a wee bit different in those days, and they would get simplified later. American spelling developed after the War of 1812, when it was deliberately done by Webster, the dictionary. So instead of spelling words the English way, they simplified the words. So program was, for example, after 1815, P-R-O-G-R-A-M, not the English way, M-M-E added, that sort of thing, you know.
Were there any other ways you tried to connect the class about the U.S. Constitution to present day besides just asking the students to use modern language when they're writing?
I don't think that I made that decision, in all honesty, because the Constitution was still in effect, as it still is for that matter, and so I didn't have to tell them the obvious. So I don't think I did.
Also in that story, you were mentioning the student evaluations, and 2 of them that you got back were more negative. Were the student evaluations for all of the classes, non-honors and honors courses, or just the honors courses at the time?
Ultimately, it was for all the classes, but that took a while. Many of my colleagues across the spectrum were frightened of student evaluations. I cannot explain why. They thought that a negative evaluation meant that they would not be considered for promotion or something to that effect. I'm not entirely certain. I can tell you one thing, where you can always get a negative evaluation, regardless, they always hated the textbooks. There wasn't a single student who ever loved the textbook. The textbook was a pain in the neck. And speaking personally, I used to tell them, don't ignore the textbook, for heaven's sakes. I realize that it can be convoluted, and I realize they can contain generalized statements with which you can easily disagree, but you need a base from which you can then see whether or not you can steal second base and score, eventually get home, that sort of thing. But to a person, male or female, if there was a question on the evaluations, a separate question, they inevitably were negative on the textbook. And the textbook was, to my recollection, required for whatever reasons, at least in the American history classes. I'm not sure what was done in the world. There were 2 kinds of world history classes. One was called Western Civilization, and the other one was an invented class that was dubbed from Plato to NATO. And so if you were in secondary education, including junior high, you needed the world history classes. That was for some reason required because of what was required in public schools. And also you needed something called History of Indiana, which I ended up once upon a time teaching for several years, because that was required in the schools. And as luck would have it, one of my students was our youngest daughter. And being as naive as I am sometimes, I thought that nobody knew she was my daughter, but everybody did. I said to her, "You were going to call me Dr. Rosenberg," publicly in class. And she forgot, called me Daddy, and everybody laughed. And then a couple of girls came up to me after class and said, "Hey, everybody in class knew Elizabeth Rosenberg. Come on. How naive you think we are." And we know you're not going to show any favoritism, so we don't worry about it. It turned out she surprised the heck out of me and was a much, much better student than I had originally thought she would be, as a matter of fact. And she wrote a brilliant response to one of my essay questions, the one she picked. And I folded the page back and showed it to her mother. And her mother said, "This is really a good answer." I said, "Read who wrote it." I said, "Elizabeth? I didn't think she was that good." So what are you going to say in that respect? So I would say that we got along in the classroom. We raised the inevitable issues. I once taught a graduate seminar, which one person said, "I think that the disciples were all homosexuals." Then they looked at me for a comment. Oh my God. I don't know why this person said it. Got a reaction, all right. Boy, what a reaction. I said, "I'm not touching that with a 10-foot pole. Forget it."
So one of the things you mentioned earlier in the interview was that you actually taught a class overseas for a while, and you were also part of the overseas program in the London Center. Could you describe a little bit about your role in that and your experiences with it as well?
Ball State was essentially catering to Indiana students whose sole ambition was someday going to New York City. And we wanted, a group of us, different departments, history, English, even business for that matter, students to see there's more to education and the world than Indiana. And so we got together and set up a sort of a pilot program. And around 1981 or thereabout, I taught overseas for the spring quarter under the direction of a guy in the English department. And in those days, if you were going to direct the honors program, the overseas program, you had to commit yourself to a year overseas. And then individual faculty came for each of the 3 quarters I happened to have the spring quarter. And presumably I did a good enough job. I don't recall. I guess the evaluations were okay and so forth. And got to remember that we're in a city whose history goes back 1,000 years. So you can take a field trip, as it were, to see something that's been around, literally, like Westminster Abbey for, if not 1,000 years, 800 years. Or the castle, constructed initially by William the Conqueror. 1,000 years, come on. I mean, what can Indiana show? You know, that sort of thing. And then my wife said, "You think you'd like to direct it sometime?" And I said, "Nah, too much responsibility." And then one day, I began thinking about it, and I said, "Yeah, I think I'll do that." So I called from my office in the Burkhardt building. I told you where it was located. And told my wife that I had put in an application to become director of the overseas program for the 3 quarters. I'm not sure what year it was in anymore. But we went on the semester program in 1986, 87, I think. So this would have been around 84, 85. Okay? And she didn't believe me at first. She said, "Well, you say you'd never do it." I said, "Well, it seemed like a good idea." And we had 3 of our children, got them in English schools with difficulty, but got them in English schools, and had a successful program, I think. The evaluations seemed to be. And then when they switched to the semester system, I was specifically asked by the administration to direct it. There was no competition. Generally, there used to be a competition to be director, and you had to give your qualifications and why should you be made director, so forth. And so I directed it during the semester changeover as well. And then when I became professor emeritus, they were having trouble getting directors. By that time, it changed from being overseas for 1 year, the whole year, to just 1 semester at a time. Largely because, in my opinion, for what it's worth, the children of the potential overseas director didn't want to leave the boyfriend or the girlfriend or the football team or the basketball team and whatever. And so I ended up twice more as an emeritus director and directing the program.
And during your time as director, were there any specific groups from the Honors College that went?
There might have been.
Okay.
There might have been. It had to do with whether or not they could fit being away from campus into their on-campus schedule, particularly if they, were required to take certain on-campus classes prior to graduation. And so consequently, I have no specific knowledge that I don't recall any student come up to me and saying, I'm in the honors college, et cetera, et cetera. So the answer to that question is most likely no. No one from business could go unless the semester faculty person, I was a director, but under me the one semester faculty person from College of Business went. Then, you see, they could take what classes they needed either directly from him or through independent study with someone back in the States. And the College of Business would accept that.
So as we come near to our time here for the interview, do you have any final comments about your time at Ball State or the Ball State Honors College since you've been here since 1961 until you retired in 1995 and even after then?
Well, to be perfectly frank with you, I have had occasion to visit campus for one reason or another regularly, when you consider that I've been retired for, 25, 26 years now. And needed to go to this or that office, sometimes the insurance office, sometimes simply to the Ball State Federal Credit Union. The big thing is that it's a different university from what I left. When I first came, bear in mind, no computers, nada. Everything paper, paper, paper. Now, bulletin board notices. Now you wish to notify a student of anything, there's the closed circuit, if I'm correct in that regard. And as a result, I cannot really make any intelligent comment about the current state of the university, other than the fact that the basic law of life is change or die. And so the university has indeed changed and therefore will not die.
And do you have any other final comments about the Honors College by chance?
No, that's my final word.
All right. So with that, I think we'll bring our interview to an end. On behalf of the Ball State University Honors College Oral History Project, I'd like to thank you, Mort, for coming today and sharing your story about the early years of Ball State University and your time in the honors program and the Honors College.
I was happy to do it. You're welcome.